The more I got into this story, the more I kind of saw it as, something like an onion, a story full of layers, and it made me want to kind of tease each of those layers apart and build them back up again one at a time. So that's what I'm going to try to do. And when you look at it, it's really just a really slight little story about a, fairly quick little event or series of events. Some guy, a monk, gets some followers who rebel against their overlords, and they have a few early victories, and then they get demolished when the heavy artillery shows up. This happens all the time, everywhere. Here's just a few examples in Cambodia in the decades prior to this particular rebellion. There's one in 1731, 1738, 1743, 1776. Unlike the others, the events of 1820 have some legs. The story stayed alive in various kinds of memory, and one of them obviously is academic memory. The story that I read and that has been posted. But that academic telling of the story draws on three known versions of what happened. Well, one version, probably the most important, is conspicuously missing. That's the version from people who were involved. They left no records. We don't really know who the people were, how many of them there were, whether they were rebelling in the first place, how long it lasted. We don't know. No versions of the story are by the people involved. They're all by people observing the people involved in the events, usually separated by a lot of space and time. So every version is really going to say more about the observer, probably, than the event itself. For instance, like I said, calling it a rebellion in the first place makes it about rebels, people acting against the existing order. That might not have been the only way to look at it. Okay, so the first and really the sparsest version is from the official Khmer annals. They talk about some monk who attracted followers by superstitious methods and who resisted authorities when they came from Phnom Penh to investigate, and he even convinced some local nobles to join him, but they eventually got put down by outside forces. That's it. There's a good reason for the official Khmer records to kind of leave it at that, because the role of Khmer officials is unclear from beginning to end, and that's probably how they'd want it. How much did Chan know, and when did he know it? What about the Khmer forces and their apparent ineffectiveness? Less said, the better. Okay, so the Vietnamese version is consistent with Cambodia's, but it adds a lot. The Vietnamese say that the people were resisting corvée. That's what was behind it all. And when local Khmer authorities try to deal with it, they fail. They try again. They fail again. And actually, some of the Khmer nobles even join the rebels. This is according to the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese forces then have to be brought in by their navy. They come, completely demolish the so-called rebels in a decisive battle. But the monk escapes. Vietnamese forces pursue him, catch him, kill him, ending the whole deal. Then they go into a big blame thing against the Khmer authorities for not handling it better. Chan actually has to travel to Saigon and give extra tribute. But as we'll see more, this so-called rebellion had millenarian overtones. People thought these were end times. Only the righteous will be saved. If that's true, in their view, the existing order was in violation of the true path, and they were just preparing to pass into a new cosmic era. That's what I mean by different versions. This version is expressed in an epic poem written in 1869, so almost 50 years later, full of the overall poem is full of heroic Khmer successes and failures, of which this event is just some of the stanzas in the overall kind of oral tradition. And in this version of the story, the monk and his followers were just innocently doing their thing when people came from the city and hassled them. Some of the officials joined them, but when the Vietnamese found out, more forces were sent. So the monk used his amulet to confer the power of invulnerability on his followers, and the forces were ineffective. The monk thought that was that, so his people went off and partied. Except the Vietnamese got smart and sent a force with no Khmer, just Cham, Malay, and Chinese. The monk tried his magic power amulet thing again, and sprinkling water, but it didn't work. He had depleted his power by being violent, and they were all slaughtered. That's the version in the popular Cambodian tradition. A third layer is the perspective of what was going on at the time. And in general, people in the area where the events occurred had been experiencing decades of Vietnamization. That means, migration. Vietnamese had nowhere to go except west and south, and they were doing it all over eastern Khmer territory. Ta Ninh district is where the events began. The people in this area were like in some friction zone between, two cultural tectonic plates, with the Cambodian plate being slowly buried under the Vietnamese. Tributary dependency, my guess is this meant a lot of rice away from Khmer bellies and into Vietnamese. Sometimes this could be ignored. But in 1802, Emperor Gia Long reunified the Vietnamese Empire and established the Nguyen dynasty. The Thai had dominated Cambodia and the ruling Varman dynasty while Vietnam was divided. But Chan's brothers rebelled in 1811, forcing Chan to Saigon for help. That led to a few years of dust-ups between the Thai and the Vietnamese forces. And when the dust had settled, the Vietnamese had the power to extract tribute and to force labor in Cambodia. It had shifted away from the Thai back to them. Gia Long's power and Chan's dependency enabled the Vietnamese emperor to demand tribute and forced labor, which he did. There was probably dozens, if not hundreds, of forced labor deals going on, but the one we care about is an 87-kilometer long, 54 miles, canal in southern Vietnam designed to give the territory of Chau Duc direct access to the Ha Tien Sea Gate in the Gulf of Siam. The result was the Vinh Tay Canal, which now makes the border between Cambodia and Vietnam in that area. It all started when Emperor Gia Long ordered the local boss to begin the project with this edict. Let me read it. Let me read a section of it. This canal digging project is tough, but its role in our national security and national defense is not small. We should accept the hardship so that our descendants would have the benefit. Yeah, imagine how motivating this would be if you were a Corvée Khmer worker. Well, he wasn't kidding that canal building is tough work. And according to the poem, as would logically be the case, the Khmers were heavily exploited by being forced to do all the worst work, which resulted in thousands of deaths from fatigue and disease. That's why the canal project helped light the fuse. That's why it became a symbol of Vietnamese mistreatment of the Khmer and became part of the poem. Also became part of Khmer Rouge anti-Vietnamese propaganda. But the canal is the micro. The bigger picture is that all in all, it felt like a way of life was over. New forms of patron relations, new forms of taxation, the whole idea of fixed fields to farm, new Buddhist forms showing up with the immigrants. To us, these are all just words. But to people there, this must have felt like the end of a way of life. It led, as it has on numerous occasions in history, both in Asia and in the so-called New World, it led to a millenarian reaction. These are the end times. The old rules don't apply. We're the saved. We do what the saved do. Rule. The Magic Monk was a millenarian movement, the head of a millenarian movement of 1820. Millenarianism goes basically like this. Religion is supposed to explain the world's imperfections and problems. Why aren't things right for me? And it does it in a variety of different ways, different times. But sometimes the world's imperfections, both general and the ones that are like in your face, cross a threshold, and the, conventional explanations that religions use for suffering don't work anymore. So they need a new explanation for why things just gotten as bad as they have. And the idea of being at the end of times is one of those kind of radical explanations. Everything's going to blow up. Everything will be justly redistributed, meaning to us, the saved. Now, there's a lot we don't know about this story of the Magic Monks Rebellion, but I think we can infer that this kind of vibe was in the air around the Cambodia, Vietnam, so-called border area, and a lot of people felt it, which made it easier to develop a following of people willing to do weird things. I think we can grasp how this might happen pretty deeply, since it's not all that different from behavior we've witnessed in our own times. And also to, kind of help along this spirit of endgame even more, I should point out that millenarianism is built into Buddhism. or at least into the form that was prevalent in that area at that time, and still now for that matter. Buddhism flourished under Chan in the Varman dynasty. He was a devout practitioner, and Maitreya was worshipped as a savior, as his coming would signal the end of all the existing misery and injustice. And what made Maitreya worship even more kind of subversive was the belief around for centuries that his coming was imminent. Not off in some distant future. Maitreya would be coming pretty soon. And this turns him into a force that can, animate a movement now. I'm not saying the magic monk led a Maitreya cult. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. We don't know. What we do know is that Buddhist culture in that place at that time strongly supported the idea of a big, quick upheaval that would topple the existing order. And it could be any day now. And so before we leave this layer of the story, I want to add a bit more and point out that there's another thread to Buddhist millenarianism that's not simply a matter of extraordinarily awful times, but a more dangerous idea. It's the idea that it's becoming the end of times, not just for you and me, but for Buddhism. It's going to die out because it's getting dominated by other religions. And right here, that means, fill in your own blank. If you're in Burma now, that would mean Rohingyans. There's a popular Buddhist saying, every household has Amitabha. Every family has Kuan Yin, Avalokiteshvara. I think this means the compassionate and present role of Avalokiteshvara is more personal and human than the kind of more abstract Pure Land Amitabha. That's just how I look at it. The Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva has been very popular in Khmer culture. He, she, is a bodhisattva who will actively protect and guide us, not sit off on the sidelines and watch. Bodhisattvas are arguably a Mahayana concept, and Avalokiteshvara may be the only one to really make it into Cambodian forms of Theravadan Buddhism. This bodhisattva has magical power and uses it to deliver us out of calamities. Avalokiteshvara isn't just a touch of hope, but an active player working to make things happen. If this is what your religion says is real, then it's not very hard to believe some monk who says he has magical powers really does. And as we all know, when people are ready to believe, and they really want to believe, it's pretty easy to get them to believe anything. And so sometime in 1820, a monk named Kai got a bunch of followers around Tay Ninh and declared himself king at Ba Phnom on a small mountain. Ba Phnom, like many mountains, has magical powers. There's evidence of human sacrifice there, which definitely helps give a place powers. So Monk Kai already has the merit from being a monk, and he already used cures and amulets to gain followers in the first place. Then he went off to the mountain to get crowned, which gave him even more. But what exactly was that power? This is kind of like a Marvel Comics movie people were into there in the real world. How did he get his superpower? Well, he got it through merit, through monkly behavior. What is his superpower? It was the power to confer invulnerability on his followers. No more, no less. There's a lot in that power, but it's missing a lot too. It's a defensive power. So with that defensive superpower, when the first bunch of local Khmer forces come at his group, they get nowhere. And when the second bunch comes, some of them even get converted. According to the poem, Kai then uses his amulet and sprinkles water and gives his people magic powers against the serious Vietnamese forces coming after them. Here's from the poem. When he heard of the expedition against him, elderly Kai washed the heads of his soldiers, reciting sutras to give them strength, and shaking drops of water onto them to keep the Vietnamese from dispersing them in the battle. If the Vietnamese fired guns, the power of the Khmer would keep the bullets from going far or coming close to them. When Kai's blessings were over, the soldiers lost their apathy and went out to battle the Vietnamese. What does that mean, the soldiers lost their apathy and went out to battle the Vietnamese? Plus, according to the poem, during that battle, Viets fell like banana stalks. That sounds like more than invulnerability to me. That sounds like violence. At this point, in the poem, Kai's people are pretty full of themselves, so they go off to party, basically, at Khao Sa Tan. I should remind you that in the Vietnamese version, the Vietnamese forces did not fall like banana stalks. and the monk, Kai, barely escaped to Khao Sa-ten when his forces were destroyed in the battle. But in the poem, they're just chilling there when they hear the forces are coming against him again. So Kai quickly does the ritual, sprinkling water again. But this time, the forces are made up of Cham, Malay, and Chinese. And the magic isn't so great against them. Plus, Kai's magic was diminished anyway because of the bad deeds they'd done, the violence part. Here's from the poem. After what he had done, the merit had faded away, and now he had no special powers. He had become an ordinary man. His honor was no longer great. His skills were ineffective. They got pounded. But they were never defeated really, especially not by the Vietnamese. They defeated themselves by screwing up. How'd they screw up? Being invulnerable to harm is different than using power to harm others, to be violent. But power is seductive. This story is about the misuse of power. Kai and his followers were seduced into using it aggressively, not just protectively. Violent actions deplete your merit. The truth is that people do have power, and it's also true that using it violently will ultimately be unsuccessful because, 1, usually the bosses have more pure violent power on hand. That's what they're good at. And 2, using violence does usually deplete the righteousness of your cause. When people act together non-violently, they are invulnerable. So the central question of any uprising of the people against the status quo is the role of the military. Will they fire on their own people? Will they be provoked into it? Khmer armies didn't do well against Kai's followers, who had religious authority with them in the form of a monk. Maybe what really happened is that Khmer armed forces wouldn't fire on the monk's people. Isn't that, in effect, being invulnerable? But then the bad guys came at them with people they couldn't influence in the same way. It was bad tactics for the situation. Kai had no inherent moral authority. They were just a bunch of violent thugs to the Vietnamese. And the Vietnamese brought in outsiders, like the Chinese brought in troops from way outside Beijing to Tiananmen Square. At Kent State University in the United States, almost 50 years ago, the National Guard fired on students who had thought they were invulnerable. And it was mind-blowing. Those students were protesting the secret bombing of Cambodia. So, to bring it all back a little closer, the granddaddy of all Asian millenarian rebellions would start in another 30 years with all the same elements. Lots of totally bummed out people, a semi-crazed guy with religious trappings, lots of powers, and a vision for totally transforming Chinese society. It's called the Taiping Rebellion. It lasted almost 15 years, and depending whose numbers you use, it's the bloodiest war in human history. 30 million people dying is considered a fairly conservative estimate. I bring this up because I think it puts the events of 1820 in eastern Cambodia in a context we should see it and then leave it. A rebellion is a fractal concept, by which I mean it looks the same at any scale you choose. There's rebellions just within neighborhoods or villages or a few districts in Cambodia near the border. Or a whole nation, like with the Taipings, where 30 million people die. Or the Khmer Rouge. Or going in the other direction, there can be rebellions within a tribe or a family. Or even within yourself. Rebellion is a thing. Rebellions are driven by deep, unignorable grievances at any scale. There are no rebellions in Happyville. To be successful, or at least to even get started as a rebellion, it helps to have some magic and moral authority going for you. At the individual scale, this might be something like, you're so bummed out about your weight that you rebel against the status quo, join a gym to transform yourself. The magic part is doing it at New Year's as a resolution, which a gazillion people do, and it works for a while, just like Kai's magic worked at first, because he was using it against forces that recognized his moral authority, his power. When you join the gym, you develop your own merit by doing it. But the newness wears off, and unexpected things come up, and the old strategies that made you invulnerable to the forces of the old status quo stop working, and you stop going to the gym sometime in the middle of February. Kai's rebellion made it to the district level, which is an accomplishment because it had a lot going for it. And then it stalled because, one, he didn't update and diversify his strategies for maintaining, in effect, invulnerability against the forces of the status quo. And two, even worse, he and his followers were seduced off the only path that can ever work, which is to connect with people and let them come to you, which Kai did at first, but then his movement turned away from connection and toward violence, which is the end. Well, I hope you enjoyed my little retelling of the Holy Man's Rebellion, the story of the Magic Monk. I sure enjoyed digging into it and telling it. And I realized I did it in a kind of idiosyncratic way. I came up with themes and perspectives that are maybe unique to me, and I'm sure someone else could have done this presentation and seen it in a very different light. And so the discussion that you have, I think, should be interesting in that regard. So let me throw out a few questions to maybe help you have some talking. Not that you necessarily need it. And the first one really comes out of what I just said. The subtitle of the article is Pre-Colonial Imperialism and Pre-Nationalist Response. I didn't really talk about those terms at all. So what I'm asking is, the backdrop to this story is in-migration, socio-cultural change associated with Vietnamization of a certain region of what we now think of as Cambodia. Is it helpful or useful to think of that as pre-colonial imperialism? I don't know. Maybe it does. That's something to think about. And also, thinking of the Holy Man's Rebellion as a pre-nationalist response, does that help us understand the event? I'm not so sure how it does. But that's something to talk about. I completely missed the themes in the subtitle. Did I miss something important? I guess another question I would have would be, is separating the different layers the way I did, was that useful? A useful way in seeing what's really going on with this story? And did I miss any important layers? I guess that's kind of a corollary to the first question. Another question I have is, why did Chandler write this article? It's really different than most of his work and actually a lot of published scholarly history. It's just kind of a story. Most of Chandler's work is either like the general history that's well known, but most of his writings have been about more recent topics, usually around Khmer Rouge. He's an establishment figure with respect to Cambodia. Academic, he's been also a consultant to USAID, to NGOs, he's been a foreign service officer. I mean, he's touched all the bases of the people who were trying to make Cambodia. And in my opinion, he needs to own that. He and others like him are part of the reason Cambodia is where it is today. How does he want us to see Cambodia? And how is this article supposed to help? Another question. What do you think it means that the monk, Kai, was apparently able to make people invulnerable for a while? What do you think of my interpretation, that Khmer forces wouldn't shoot at a Khmer Buddhist monk or his supporters, which is de facto invulnerability? Do you think there's any role for violence in a rebellion? Do you think there's any role? Do you have any personal favorite rebellions you'd like to bring up? Make some point maybe about violence or non-violence. My last question I'll throw out. If everything about you was just the same, except you were born in the Tay Ninh area in 1800, so you were 20 at the time of the Magic Monks Rebellion, would you have joined?
Well, hi, and thanks again. I really had a blast doing this, just trying to figure out everything there was in this really neat little story, and then to find a good way to tell it and share what I think I found there. And I was always thinking about this small group of people I like at YK Art House there in Phnom Penh. It would help them, but now that I'm done, I kind of like it. Maybe put it up on Facebook or Medium or something like that. I think if anybody reads this all the way through, it gets you thinking about rebellion, gets you thinking about violence. Definitely a couple of topics worth thinking about. So I say, because you should all feel free to share it too. If you think, certainly all the people ever associated with Read Cambodia, make sure they can see it, but anybody else you feel like sharing it with. There you go. But by all means, let me know how it works out, for the live event there at Read Cambodia. And maybe we've taken a baby step toward, extending things a little bit more in space and time, and can, broaden Read Cambodia just a little bit more. So anyway, hope this does work there. I look forward to seeing all you again soon. But meanwhile, this is what I got. Hope it works, and see you again soon. Bye for now.